So, what does it mean to be humble? Do you consider this a desirable quality? Why or why not? If we study the theoretical literature, we find a number of key features associated with the virtue of humility. For instance, it could be an accurate, not an underestimated, sense of one's abilities and achievements, the ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, imperfections, gaps in knowledge, and limitations, openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice, keeping one's abilities and accomplishments in perspective. It's a relatively low focus on self or an ability to even forget the self. It can be an appreciation of the value of all things, as well as the many different ways that people and things contribute to our world. Seligman and Peterson, in their VIA 24 character strengths, posit that humility is regarded to be a private stance, an evaluation of self, versus modesty, which is a more socially oriented virtue. Some individuals associate negative attributes to humility. For example, some might think of a humble person as being weak or passive. They might think of a person with downcast eyes and lacking in self-respect and confidence. Others might even confuse humility with humiliation, prompting images of shame, embarrassment, or disgust with oneself. But I would argue that humility need not imply a negative view of self. In fact, some humble individuals can have rather positive opinions of themselves if they base their worth on their intrinsic values, good qualities, a sense of compassion towards themselves, connections with other people, and perhaps even their alignment with a higher power or higher being. So, what then is actually the essence of the virtue of humility? Thought leaders Peterson and Seligman, who are the authors of Character, Strengths, and Virtues, believe that humility involves a non defensive willingness to see the self accurately, including strengths and limitations. They note that humble individuals will not fully distort information in order to defend, repair, or verify their own image. Humble individuals, there is no real press towards self-importance nor a burning need to see or present themselves as being better than they actually are. Humble individuals are not particularly interested in the domination of others in order to receive entitlements or elevate their own status. Peterson and Seligman posit that humility implies a willingness to see the self accurately, willing and able to weigh information in a non-defensive way, willing to look objectively at the self. Some scholars argue that humility implies people's ability to transcend a focus on the self, to be able to view themselves from a broader perspective. Those scholars suggest that people are humble when they consider their own small role in the universe, their weakness in comparison to a higher being. In some studies, asking individuals to identify situations in which they felt humble, many identified situations involving the contemplation of nature and natural wonders. Humility really involves knowing our limits, taking different perspectives, and being curious. Psychologists Nemec and McGrath note that humility means accurately evaluating your accomplishments. They discuss the fact that it is fairly easy to describe what humility is not. It's not bragging. It's not doing things in excess. It's not seeking the spotlight, not drawing attention to yourself, and not viewing yourself as more special or important than others. On the other hand, they note that humility is not bowing to every wish or command of another person or not being highly self-critical. Truly humble people think well of themselves. They have a good sense of who they are, but they're also aware of their mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and their imperfections. Most importantly, Nemec and McGrath say that humble individuals are content without being the center of the attention or getting praise for their accomplishments. Humble people would rather blend into the crowd than to stand out. If you're high in humility, you're good at putting others first, giving them attention and letting others take the spotlight. Usually, a humble person will find it easy to make friends because humility protects one from shifting into self-serving modes of arrogance or being driven by ego needs. When we are at our best with humility, we have a balanced and accurate view of ourselves and can see our place in the larger world. We acknowledge our imperfections, and we help others to be successful. Research on the findings of the benefits of the strengths of the virtue of humility include things such as humility is linked with good self-esteem and positive self-view. Humble people are likely to demonstrate higher levels of gratitude, forgiveness, spirituality, and even general health. Humility strengthens social bonds, and research shows that humble people are more helpful, agreeable, and generous. Other people generally like humble individuals and feel less threatened by them. Additional benefits include emotional wellness, self-control, and feeling less self-preoccupied. Humility has been shown in studies to be associated with perseverance, self-regulation, and kindness towards others. Humility is also related to having less anxiety about death and religious tolerance and those types of topics. I'm going to ask you to pause here and to go back to the prerequisite folder where you found this video and download the humility assessment. I'm going to ask you to please take this assessment, and as you respond to each item, please be honest with yourself. You're not going to be sharing the results. And although you may intend to exhibit a behavior or a trait as a future leader, this exercise really requires that you respond to each item based on who you are today, how you behave today. Once you've completed the self-assessment scale and have calculated your scores for the 3 categories at the bottom of the page, make sure that you jot that information into your journal or notebook. While you have those journals out and handy, please take a look at the 3 questions on this slide. Pause the video and jot down your answers to all 3 of these questions. Just what are the advantages of being humble? Where does your humility come from, and how do you express it? How do you balance humility with a need for recognition and appreciation? According to Nemec and McGrath, to brag and portray yourself as better or more important than others is to underuse humility. In fact, in some cultures, boasting or bragging is actively punished. There does seem to be a common tendency to underuse humility in many cultures. However, bragging about your accomplishments can also be an important part of achieving success in certain fields. So what represents underuse of humility has to be considered in the light of your culture's expectations. It's not unusual for people to want to share their successes and accomplishments, at least to some degree. It feels good to be appreciated, and it's quite normal and healthy to want to share your strengths, stories, positive experiences, positive contributions, and/or accomplishments. The underuse of humility emerges, however, when we take this to a level of boasting, when the sole purpose is to promote yourself. Underuse can also unwittingly occur when you don't stop to consider how much others have contributed to your own success, or when you discount someone who's receiving an accolade because you didn't receive one as well, or when you're unable to set aside competitiveness to appreciate another person's accomplishments. The overuse of humility turns into something else. This is where we get into self-deprecation, excessive self-criticism, or subservience. While a reasonable level of humility is associated with good esteem, an excessive degree of humility can be indicative of a very poor self-image. A subtle reality of humility overuse is that the humble person is denying themselves to other people who may want to get to know more about them. This can obstruct a relationship from developing because people don't have an opportunity to get to know you or may interpret your behavior as secretive or withholding. Some forms of humility overuse reflect a rather unhealthy degree of skepticism or negativity about yourself. Thought leaders Mary Crossan, Gerard Sajitz, and Jeffrey Gans suggest that there are 8 character elements that combine to foster humility in leaders. You can see those 8 elements on this slide. In terms of self-awareness, they note that humble leaders are mindful of their own feelings, thoughts, values, motives, reactions, and behaviors. This self-awareness helps leaders to be more successful in their interactions and provides a critical feedback loop. Self-awareness comes in part through experience and seasoning. As aspiring leaders, it's important to take time to learn just what you're good at. Find out what you're not so good at, and don't be afraid to say that you're not good at something. In terms of modesty, humble leaders do not unduly call attention to their own accomplishments. Celebrity teaches us to act in a certain way, pampered, celebrated, or spoiled, and those behaviors are simply counterproductive. Humble leaders do not expect to be treated in a special way. They just give things their best and sometimes end up getting recognized for their efforts and accomplishments. As the old saying goes, people that mind don't matter, and people that matter don't mind. Leaders should not do things because they want to be recognized or be on some list. They should end up on that list because they simply want to do things. In terms of being reflective, humble leaders frequently examine their mental models and thinking habits to cultivate constructive thought patterns and constructive conduct. For many successful leaders, reflection is inseparable from leadership. Charles Brindamour is the CEO of Canada's leading insurance company, Intact Financial, and he is quoted as saying, "I reflect all the time about the impact I have on others. I step back and look and have this inner dialogue on the impact I have with others. I consider whether that impact was constructive. I reflect on my leadership." In terms of being a continuous learner, humble leaders seek and enjoy new opportunities to learn and grow on a continual basis. Good leaders never lose their impulse to learn new things. They know that once they lose that impulse, complacency sets in. And as aspiring leaders, you do not have to go looking for opportunities to learn. Simply, you have to recognize and take advantage of those opportunities as they present themselves to you. Anthony C. Milano, who is the artistic director of Canada's Stratford Shakespeare Festival, notes that there is something to be learned every day, both by looking in the mirror at yourself and by looking at the people around you. And while we readily see ways that others can improve themselves, it's best to start with yourself. In terms of being curious, humble leaders demonstrate a genuine fascination with a wide variety of topics. They express a keen interest in seeking out new information and novel experiences. And they approach these learning opportunities with an open, inquisitive, really non-judgmental attitude. The curious leader finds a broad range of ideas and contexts that are interesting and is humble enough to park his or her ego and venture into the unknown. In terms of being respectful, the humble leader really always treats others with dignity, especially when providing feedback. Humble leaders remain tolerant, civil, courteous, and constructive with others. Public displays of disdain are rarely likely to work in a leader's favor. In terms of gratefulness, humble leaders sincerely acknowledge and appreciate others' contributions. Humble leaders feel thankful for the things they've received in this life. Genuine gratitude serves humility because we lose our sense of self-importance when we have a deeply felt appreciation for even the smallest thing around us. Mary Croissant and her colleagues suggest one simple gratitude exercise to get you started. Imagine all the things that had to happen so that you could have a piece of paper on your desk in front of you. That piece of paper connects you with an incredible range of people over multiple generations, as well as with the natural world. All those people, places, and resources deserve your gratitude. In terms of being vulnerable, humble leaders allow others to see their true self. Leaders need to remember the importance of being open and vulnerable. Croissant, Sagitz, and Gantz remind us that these 8 character elements work together to support the leader virtue of humility. Being reflective is critical to self-awareness. When you are grateful for what you have, it brings perspective to where you fit in the bigger picture. And this sense of your relative place in the world is particularly powerful when you're a continuous learner. Being grateful and a continuous learner will support a sense of modesty and reduce the inclination to act in a self-serving manner. These elements, in turn, foster being respectful of others. Thought leader Amy Newman states that when humility is present in organizations, people are willing to discuss mistakes openly and focus on continuous learning. When humility is absent, we see arrogance and little commitment to improvement. In times of crisis and/or change, a realistic view helps leaders to be nimble and manage uncertainty. For example, a humble leader will ask, "How can we improve this? What do others see that I also need to see?" Being humble allows us to learn from mistakes, which then results in better performance over time. Newman reminds us that studies show that humble leaders have a positive effect on team performance. When leaders demonstrate humility by admitting limitations, highlighting others' strengths, and being teachable, team members report better task allocation and performance. This includes disclosing what is relevant to the team and may not readily be seen by others. For example, a humble leader is willing to say something like, "I don't have the experience working with this. Could you take the lead on this given your experience in the area?" When a leader makes a move like that, success becomes more likely for the entire team. From his 20 plus years of studying organizations, the researcher Jim Collins identified humility as a distinguishing factor in taking companies from good to great. You may remember his book. Collins coined that term level 5 to describe the type of leader needed to transform an organization and sustain high levels of performance. Collins noted that level 5 leaders build enduring greatness through a paradoxical combination of personal humility plus professional will. He contends that they are a paradox because they demonstrate elements that we don't typically imagine as complementary. Collins suggests that such leaders are really a study in duality. They're both modest and willful, shy and fearless, and likely to attribute their success to luck and yet have high standards and an unwavering resolve for results. Humble people can demonstrate a calm determination that makes them powerful leaders. I would ask you to pause here just for a moment and take a look at this table that really gives you a bird's eye view of how Collins compares personal humility and professional will. In an attempt to gather other perspectives, humble leaders frequently seek and accept feedback. There are some organizational feedback processes that are common and useful. And there are also less formal approaches that leaders can initiate to demonstrate their openness to change and information about what they need to do to improve. The exercise on this slide may help you think about how open you are to hearing difficult feedback. Humble leaders ask for feedback and then must have the courage to see multiple perspectives that may conflict with their own. Being open to constructive or negative feedback is sometimes easier said than done. As leaders may be inclined to say that we are open to feedback, but the reality is that hearing critical comments is almost always painful. It's important as we strive to be both effective and ethical leaders. We need to fight against what might be the most natural reactions to feedback. Perhaps taking a page from Brené Brown, rather than feeling shame, we need to use lessons learned about vulnerability to recognize that the feedback does not define us. Feedback represents someone else's view of one aspect of who we are. It's an opportunity for improvement, a chance to grow, instead of a reason to hide. Please pause here and walk through the items on this table to get an idea of how you typically respond to constructive feedback. Mark your scores in your journal. We'll talk about these later. Now that you've done a little self-assessment about the way you receive feedback, I'm going to ask you to return once again to your journal and jot down your answers to these questions. What is your typical approach to receiving feedback? Think of an example of a time when you asked for feedback. Was this difficult for you? What about a time when you avoided asking for feedback? Was that difficult for you? What, if anything, are you learning now about your ability to humbly receive feedback? Intellectual humility is a type of humility that allows us to be open to changing our views. Amy Newman posits that leaders can learn about different views by approaching issues from the stance of curiosity. Recent research on intellectual humility is helping us to understand more about how leaders can be open to different perspectives. One informal description of intellectual humility that's offered by Newman is, do you recognize that what you believe may be wrong, and are you willing to change your mind? There was a Duke University study that compared people they classified as intellectually humble and those that were intellectually arrogant. They defined the intellectually arrogant participants as those who rarely admitted to being wrong and were unwilling to change their minds. When these groups were given statements about controversial topics to read, including some fake news, the humble group of participants took longer to read and did a better job of distinguishing what fake was. The arrogant group of participants read quickly and didn't even know the news was fake. This study supports another in which it was found that people with high intellectual humility did a better job of evaluating evidence and persuasive arguments. Because they recognized that their beliefs might be wrong, they more easily distinguished between strong and weak arguments. Newman concludes that we need to be vulnerable to be humble, and that without humility, we cannot even see what we need to learn. Psychologists have developed a scale on this slide to help leaders measure their intellectual humility. I would ask you to pause here, take a few moments, and rate yourself on the 6 items here. As you might suspect, research studies show that intellectual humility is associated with such qualities as openness, curiosity, tolerance of ambiguity, and low dogmatism. Researchers have actually identified two types of curiosity, specific and diversive. Specific curiosity is about finding a solution for a problem. Diversive curiosity is broader. In this situation, the person is seeking new information or new ways to synthesize what's already known. Now, Amy Newman notes that both of these are important for learning and for leading with humility. Curiosity is a powerful tool. It helps us to approach problems and questions with an open mind. It helps us to remember that we're not always right and helps us to be open to other points of view. I'm going to ask you to take a few moments now to watch this TED Talk delivered by Julia Galef as she discovers and talks about her theory about soldiers and scouts and their mindsets. I personally think she's describing humility. Humble leaders make space for others to thrive. And they take action. They take action in at least 4 different areas. For instance, in relationships, if you want to take action, you want to write a personal account of the time when you were especially humble, but not critical of yourself. Also, prime yourself to be humble before interacting in one of those relationships. This might mean spending a few minutes thinking about humility, and that will really help you to act with that person in a better way. Also, you can ask a trusted friend to give you feedback on your struggles and areas of improvement. In terms of at school, you can express humility by attentively listening to your coworkers' ideas. Compliment them when you feel they have good input without trying to load on your ideas. Notice if you speak more than others in a group or team situation. You might then want to focus on other people in the group. You can think of a situation in which you focus more on your needs, feelings, or interests than those of others. Next time you're in that situation, you might want to spend the majority of time focusing on the other person, their hopes, their needs, their views, and ideas. In terms of the broader community, you can actually just sit down and think for yourself, am I less modest around certain groups of people? If so, maybe I need to take a different approach. You can also scour for your exemplars of humility in your community and reflect on the evidence that supports their humility. Finally, you may want to turn inward. Take time to observe and appreciate your many character strengths, talents, interests, and resources by sitting with these, literally in a quiet space, and appreciating them in a positive, upbeat, balanced, and completely humble way. Humble leaders make space for others to thrive. And they take action. They take action in at least 4 different areas. For instance, in relationships, if you want to take action, you want to write a personal account of the time when you were especially humble, but not critical of yourself. Also, prime yourself to be humble before interacting in one of those relationships. This might mean spending a few minutes thinking about humility, and that will really help you to act with that person in a better way. Also, you can ask a trusted friend to give you feedback on your struggles and areas of improvement. In terms of at school, you can express humility by attentively listening to your coworkers' ideas. Compliment them when you feel they have good input without trying to load on your ideas. Notice if you speak more than others in a group or team situation. You might then want to focus on other people in the group. You can think of a situation in which you focus more on your needs, feelings, or interests than those of others. Next time you're in that situation, you might want to spend the majority of time focusing on the other person, their hopes, their needs, their views, and ideas. In terms of the broader community, you can actually just sit down and think for yourself, am I less modest around certain groups of people? If so, maybe I need to take a different approach. You can also scour for your exemplars of humility in your community and reflect on the evidence that supports their humility. Finally, you may want to turn inward. Take time to observe and appreciate your many character strengths, talents, interests, and resources by sitting with these, literally in a quiet space, and appreciating them in a positive, upbeat, balanced, and completely humble way. You may or may not be familiar with David Brooks. He's a really rather well-known author, worked a lot for the New York Times. He wrote the book, The Road to Character, which is actually one I'd highly recommend. An easy book to read because each chapter is an isolated vignette about a person of character. And he later also wrote what's called The Second Mountain. You might find it really interesting to open the PDF that's in our prerequisite folder, that's entitled The Moral Bucket List. It's actually an article he wrote for the New York Times in 2015. Be interested after you read that article. Be sure you jot your thoughts, your reactions in your journal. Finally, I just want to introduce you to the Hexaco model. The Hexaco model of personality structure is actually a six-dimensional model of human personality that was created by Ashton and Lee and explained in their book, The H Factor of Personality, which is based on the findings of a series of lexical studies involving several European and Asian languages, actually. The Hexaco model of personality conceptualizes human personality in terms of six dimensions. You can see the six dimensions here on the screen. The six factors are then measured through a series of questions designed to rate an individual on the levels of each factor. This takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. There's actually about 100 questions, and then a few additional research questions and optional demographic questions. It'd be interesting to do this and sit down and jot your information together, and we'll talk about it.